Okay, guys, how we doing? Here we are. We're going to try this and see if it works. The idea, of course, being that I'm sort of lecturing you. You guys take notes when you need to. I'm going to remind you of things to write down. I know this isn't ideal, and I really hope everybody's doing okay. This is sort of a really weird and unpredictable time. So hang in there. Let me know what I can do for you. Let's just kind of hold our breath. I think things will get better. As a historian, I can tell you that this is not the worst pandemic, not even close. 1957 Asian flu, 1918 Spanish flu. So yeah, I mean, let's in perspective. I don't know if that helps or not, but just something to think about. So the idea is I'm going to do a couple installments. It's the first installment of PowerPoints here, and hopefully we'll be able to um, get a good understanding of this stuff in the next little bit. So um, let's get started here. So what is the Wild West? How do you define that? What is the myth of the West? How do you make sense of this time period? And I want you to think about, and this might apply more to your grandparents than it will to you, but the cowboys, the Indians, the outlaws, the horses, the bank robberies, the trains, the stuff that lives in our pop culture. At least it used to, and we'll talk about that. It's not as prevalent as it used to be. But everybody grew up in most of the 20th century with this ideal picture of what the cowboy is. And we sort of see that has taken on a myth, or it's become a myth for so many Americans. And we now look at this and say things like, okay, some of this was true about the West, but some of it's not. And let me just give you an example. Billy the Kid claimed to kill 21 people. He probably killed 4, maybe 8, if he's lucky. There was supposed to be bank robberies every day. You'd be lucky if you got, once, one or twice a month in the worst situations. And generally, it was more like 1 or twice a year. So what you're getting here is sort of I don't want to shatter the myth, because there are some things that are cool about it. Wild Bill Hickok was this great gunslinger. They used to call him Shoot-Us back then. But most of the West that we know is sort of been romanticized. And who romanticizes it better than anyone else? Well, the one and only John Wayne. So what I thought I would do is let you watch a second here of the one and only, the Duke. And I want you to pay attention to the myth here that gets established with this clip here.
Farrell, you and your brother stand clear. I got no interest in you today. Stand clear and you won't get hurt.
What's your intention? You think 1 on 4 is a dog fall?
I mean to kill you in 1 minute, Ned, or see you hanged in Fort Smith at Judge Parker's convenience. Which'll it be?
I call that bold talk for a one-eyed fat man.
Fill your hand, you son of a bitch!
Shoot them! They're too far and they're moving too fast.
No grit, Rooster Cogburn, not much.
Rooster, I'm shot to pieces.
Hooray for the man from Texas!
Okay, so I hope you enjoyed that clip. I think there's some pretty fascinating things we could kind of talk about. The fact that John Wayne's he's going full gallop here. He's got a 6-shooter in one hand and a lever action in the other, and he's using one hand with a lever action. And the idea how insanely difficult that would be to shoot somebody like this. But this is where your grandparents, what they grew up on. These were John Wayne was the most famous movie actor at one point, or at least he was up there. And they represented this Western spirit that people loved about America. And that's one thing I want you guys to understand as we're kind of looking at the West. We obviously live here in the West. And a question that I would want to ask you first of all is, where does the West begin and end? What are the borders of the West? These are important questions to think about here as we're moving forward. But the myth, right? And one thing that I'd also like you to write down right now is that the cowboy becomes like the European knight. And what I mean by knight, of course, is the Knight. The medieval knight, there is this sense of heroism, and they live by a code, and think about that gun shooting scene. It was almost like jousting, right? I love it. And so, one thing to really think about here is how we look at cowboys to be uniquely American. Just like knights are uniquely European, cowboys are uniquely American. Now, some of you are thinking, well, aren't there cowboys in different countries? Absolutely. But the American cowboy, I think, is a unique experience. It's a unique culture. Okay. Well, let's keep moving here. What is the frontier? This is an important question that we often struggle with as historians in the American West. Is there an actual place on the outskirts of civilization? And then how do you define the frontier? Is it based on how many people are there? Is it based on how wild it is? These are questions people were dealing with. So in 1893, a guy by the name of Frederick Jackson Turner made this very, very famous statement that the frontier is gone, that it's closed. And so is the first period of American history. And his idea is that all of America had been this idea of this transition from a savaged, uncivilized place to a place of, and there's a transition he talks about to where we get to people with cities and all of this. And so his claim here is in 1893 it's done, and he used the 1890 census to make this claim that, look, there's no longer a place that is frontier. Of course, some of you are thinking, well, there is places, right? Alaska is called the Lost Frontier. What about space or the ocean? But for Frederick Jackson Turner, it was over. And maybe there's some truth to it. Maybe there's not. I'm not much of a Turnerian. Some people really follow this belief system. But he does strike an important conversation. Well, speaking of the West, Mormons play as important role here as anybody. And that may be hard to believe because they seem like such an offshoot, sort of this branch. But if you look at their kingdom, and I really call Brigham Young's, religion here, Mormonism, a kingdom. He went from all the way to Canada to Mexico and west to San Francisco. And so, this guy had control. He ruled with an iron fist in these areas. And, look at some of these towns that it's kind of hard to believe, actually, that they were once Mormon settlements. Vegas, of course, Frisco, and Los Angeles were all places where Mormons helped settle. And so you're looking at this, and so this is why we say Mormons play an important role in establishing the West. Now, what happens, and this may be true for many of you, if you have ancestors that came over here, is that they would come across the trail or whatever, or the train eventually, and Brigham Young would say, okay, we need more people in Moab or Manti or St. George. And so they sent your family there. Now, if you're from a place like, let's say, Denmark, and they send you to Fillmore, they're very different. But this is what your prophet told you to do, so you don't fight back. You don't push back. And so this is what allows Mormonism, but I think also Americanism to grow, because Mormons tended to be more American or European, you could say, at this point, and at least white, right? Spreads white culture would be a better way to say it. There's the trail, of course, that they walked over. Okay, so let's come back to the legendary Wild West for a second. There's a couple things I want you to write down. So one thing that Western men, I want you to think about when you think of a cowboy, what do you think of? We usually have this idea of a vigorous manhood. And what that means is a specific type of masculinity, almost what we'd call muscular masculinity. And then you'd put this connected with religion, and it's muscular Christianity. It's this belief that you're supposed to be strong and capable, but at the same time, you're a good person, you're a good Christian person, you help people out. And what happens is these myths start to grow out of these cowboys that come out of here. Now, we'll talk about the actual ranchers in a few minutes, but you have these dime novels, and I'll come back to some things in a second, but they were literally a dime, right? You spent a dime for them, and what they would do is somehow half a dime. You can see spend 5 cents for these ones, and you would read about these stories about Jesse James and the Younger Gang, or you would read about maybe Wild Bill Hickok and how fast he was with a gun, and all it did was bleed into this idea. Now, at the heart of it, of course, was one of the most important promoters of the West, and one of the people who brought the myth of the West. And he brought it right into to people's homes, and that's Wild Buffalo Bill Cody. And you're going to want to write down his name, Buffalo Bill Cody, William Cody. And he was one who brought the West to people around the world. So I wanted to show you. I thought I had a clip about him. Maybe I don't. Maybe I'll try to put a clip on here for him. But anyway, so he used to do these amazing shows, and he'd bring people to the East, or he'd bring, Indians, real life Indians. In fact, he brought Sitting Bull. He actually got Sitting Bull to come with him, and you learned about him last time. And they would go and they would put on these Wild West shows. And what it would be William Cody, Buffalo Bill, saving the day from the savage Indians. And that was the sort of story of the Buffalo Bill show. Now, this is what people in New York and Staten Island, there was 1 million people that saw him one summer. He would go to Paris and show this. And you imagine how crazy this was for Parisians to see the West like this. Now, it was romanticized, right? I mean, the truth is that most people living in the West lived pretty bland, normal lives, just like you do now in the West. But everyone wanted to believe that you all had 6-shooters, you had a horse, you had a cowboy hat, and it was violence. And that just isn't the truth. Okay, so the thing that was true about cowboys is that it didn't really matter the color of your skin as much. Deadwood Dick being one of the more important ones here. He was black, but he was capable, right? He was good with a shot, and so that's all they cared about. And he even transcended gender to some extent. Annie Oakley being one of these women that was as good of a shot as anyone. And don't get me wrong, this doesn't mean that there shouldn't be separate spheres, what we call women and men, and we'll get to that when we get to Victorianism. But you could, in Western places, overcome that to some extent if you were very talented or skilled. Another important part of the West is who should control the West. Should it be cattle grazing, or should it be for farmland? And generally speaking, it sort of became this big debate amongst people, and it actually ended up there was a pretty nasty war happened called the Pleasant Valley War, and 30 people died there as they were fighting over this. And ultimately, one thing will make the decision, and that's barbed wire. Once barbed wire gets up, the ranchers can't push their cattle through this, and so a lot of ways farmers won. Now you're going to see this that neither of them really won, and ranchers are still out there, but there are more farmers than ranchers, generally speaking. Oh, and there's a picture of Buffalo Bill's Wild West show that he would do. Okay, what about the Transcontinental Railroad, right? Last year, we just celebrated what was 150 years of the Golden Spike, of course, and this completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. So, this was quite a feat if you think about the actual geography here of where they went. Now, these guys, what would be called the Eastern leg, had it a little easier than the Western leg, and that's because of the Sierras. Now, you did have the Rockies, so Colorado that you'd come through, but they were able to get through the plains a lot quicker. So how'd this whole thing work? Well, this was sponsored by some very wealthy people, and just to give you some numbers here, you would make, they got it worked out to where for every mile, they made, I think, $16,000, and for every mile in the mountains, they made like $38,000, maybe even more, like $48,000. So it was insane. And so the idea was just push through, and then you get all this money. Now, of course, who did they hire to do this? Well, in the eastern leg, they made up Irish laborers, and the Irish laborers would get paid hardly anything, but you get these guys making $16,000 a mile, and Irish workers maybe get $1 a day. Same with Chinese. Chinese sometimes were given even worse pay, and it becomes really difficult for them. But of course, they keep pushing, and then they do all these crazy. I mean, they have to build. Think about where they're building. They actually build right where Donner was, right up in the mountains, and they're pushing through these really granite rocks and blowing dynamite. And it was a really intense time. But eventually in 1869 they complete it, which then allows travel time. Think about this, right? Well, it used to take 3 or 4 months to move across the plains. Now you do it in maybe 10, 12 days. Here is that, of course, Golden Spike. If you've never been up to Corinne, I would recommend taking a trip up there. It's a pretty cool place to see. Okay, well, let's move on here. That's really it about the West. There's some mining towns, and there's some ranching that we could talk about. And that's really where your danger was, I would say. But let's move on to something else. We just got to kind of keep pushing on. So this is chapter 19 in the textbook, which some of you probably didn't buy, and that's okay. But we're going to look at something called the Gilded Age here, and we're going to try to figure out, okay, what is that? Look at the dates here, right? So 1865 is when the Civil War ended. So this is post-Civil War America in the 19th century, second half of America in the 19th century, the 1800s. And a lot of it has to do with this concept of production and consumption. So let's get started here. Okay, so we call this the rise of industry and the triumph of business. So what we're going to say here is a couple things, is that and you might want to just write this down, the soldier and farmer are replaced with businessman and politician. So let's sort of make sense of this. All right, so let's think about back in the day, right? So if you think about the people that you know about, the people we've talked about in history so far, it's been a lot of soldiers. It's been George Washington. It's been Andrew Jackson. It's been George Armstrong Custer, George Meade, McClellan, Grant. These guys are all generals. They're soldiers. They're all West Point. But we're suddenly switching over here. And let's play this game, for example. If anyone can name one general or admiral in the United States military today, I would be very shocked. You might get one. I know I got a couple people that were military, but I would be very shocked if you could name very many. Now, if I were to turn it around and say, can you name a businessman? Most of you could be like, yeah, Mark Cuban or Jeff Bezos or Steve Jobs or Bill Gates. Politician, some of you like, well, I could at least name probably Mitt Romney. And the reason for that is because these guys suddenly become our heroes. They become the people we look up to. And that's because we sort of change as a country what matters. And another thing is, this is when we really start to let down Jefferson. We really just sort of destroy that Jeffersonian agrarianism we talked about, that farming life. And because of that, we'll talk about the farmer starts to disappear. And he tries to come back, and we'll talk about that, but generally disappears. Okay, well, let's take a look at this this great picture here. This is, anyone want to guess what city this is? This is Chicago. That's right there. Chicago in 1900. Now, I'm going to use this city as a perfect example about what the Gilded Age or what this time period is. And we're going to use this word called modernism. I want you to think about what makes something modern, what brings about modernity. And, there's a lot of things. Today, think about when we use that term, we're probably talking about cell phones or computers, a modern cell phone, a modern computer. These are the ways we would look at technology. However, back then, that's still kind of how it is, but it also has to do with this concept of technology, but also speed. So much of modernity has to do with speed. So let's take Chicago, for example. Let's see all the things that are modern here. First of all, this is how you know it's Chicago. This is the L train, if you've ever been there. So New York has the subway, which runs underground, and the L train in Chicago runs above ground. Notice what we've got here, lights. Think about how lights add speed. Instead of lighting a fire, lighting a candle, you turn on a light. Boom. Think about speed in terms of how fast we're moving. Cars, trolleys, we have asphalt now, which makes you move smoother and quicker. So a lot of it is just trying to speed things up for us and make things easier. It's new, it's cutting edge, it's right there. That's what this time period, the Gilded Age, is really about. It's about making America modern. And we do step into, I think, a modern mindset after the Civil War. Okay, so who coined this term, the Gilded Age? What the heck are we even talking about here? Well, this was coined by the one and only, the very famous Mark Twain, the satirist, right? The great humorist, one of the great writers in American history. And this is what I mean by Gilded Age. You want to write this down or pay attention to it. What he's saying is that America is covered with gold on the outside. We look great on the outside, but we're worn down and corrupt underneath. Meaning that everything looks great, and we're going to talk about this. We're becoming modern. We're building things. We're becoming this, what a world power, right? Militarily, technologically, and that's important. People from the outside are seeing that. But what Twain's saying is, if you really look at us close, if you put us under a magnifying glass, you'll actually start to see that we're pretty messed up. We're pretty impoverished at places and corrupt underneath. So that's what he means. A good example here would be a golden hammer, right? Think about how nice this hammer looks. Looks new, looks nice. But it very well just could be this, couldn't it? Some hammer that we painted and put some gold spray paint on. Doesn't change how effective the hammer is. Just makes it look nice, okay? So that's what Twain's talking about. Historians have sort of used that as an example. Okay, so where are we talking here? We have talked in 3 areas so far. We started with Reconstruction. Think about that, right? That's the idea of you were learning about last time, which is the Jim Crow era, the idea of healing and justice, the Southern sort of mindset that they lose their power. That's part of this time period too, in 1870, 1865, there's a lot of debate on what that is. And then we just got done talking about the West, the ranching, the mining, the farming, the cowboy spirit that's there. But what we're really going to pay attention to is this Northeast area right here. And what I will argue, as most historians do, is, sorry about the beeping, it'll happen every once in a while, is that this time period will give the East Coast the power to control the rest of the nation. And isn't that we can pretend, but let's be honest. The East sort of writes our narrative. And that's just the reality of what we live in today, I think. And we'll see how that happens. Okay, so we're going to talk about the 3 shuns here with this. Industrialization, mass immigration, and urbanization. And all of these 3 things lead to us becoming modern. That's what makes us modern. It also what makes us, in some ways, corrupt a little bit, and we'll kind of talk about that. But we're going to look at these 3 things here today with the Gilded Age. Well, a good way to start, let's start with some numbers here, okay? So what I would like you to do in your notes is just take a second, maybe about 15 seconds. I want you to write down what you think these 2 numbers represent. $590. And that is, if you can tell, 11 billion. So take a little shot at that. Okay. Hopefully people had some ideas that came to mind. This is the annual income for an American in 1890. And this is how much the richest man in American history had at this time. And that is, see if everybody guess his name, John D. Rockefeller. I don't know if I can spell his name, sorry. And John D. Rockefeller was so rich, $11 billion rich, that, I mean, think about this, right? $590 is how much you make usually. $11 billion. If we were to look at this today, he would have considering inflation, he would have $350 billion if he was living today. If you look at second place today, the richest man in America today, that is Jeff Bezos, who roughly has about $130 billion. So he doesn't even come close to Rockefeller. So how does he do this? How do you become, and that's just not the richest man living at the time. This is the richest man in history. And so let's take a look at this. How did he do it? Oil. He's the oil tycoon. And we're going to talk about how he becomes so brilliant at this to make this much money. Okay, to help us understand the idea of how much money is going around, we understand this sentence first. America becomes the world's leader in railroad and steel and oil production. And boy, do they ever, right? They make it left and right. This is that gold part that we're going to be talking about, that Twain's talking about, right? We are becoming impressive, right? People are buying railroad steel from us and oil from us, and we become just sort of like noticed on the map, if you will. But to help you understand how there's the good and bad that come with this, I want you to come up with this and write this idea of creative destruction. This is an interesting concept. Now, they seem like antonyms, and you're like, well, they're opposites, but they actually work together, right? How do you create and destroy at the same time? Well, think about this, for example. How, and you could do this with everything almost. Anytime you create something, there's usually something being destroyed. Now, let's take some obvious here, okay? All these triangles dotting the map are major steel plants. Now, they are creating steel, and we'll talk about steel in just a few minutes. But at the same time, they're also destroying the land. Think about the environment here that is getting messed up. And so you have all of this steel being produced, but you're messing up the land. That's the destruction part. Another thing about factory work is this is a really hard time for the worker in America and the immigrant. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. The worker becomes completely overwhelmed. There's no protection. And he's working hard. And he's building all these great things, but at what cost, right? The cost of he's breaking his body, right? Destroying his body for the creation of the steel. I will give you an example of that in a little bit. How about this, right? I had a student one year say to me, well, what about, students, or what about families? And families are getting destroyed because now you've got child labor and you have women working. And so the family life or childhood is getting destroyed. So you want to be thinking about how this is juxtaposed against each other. And that's a good way to understand this time period. Look at all the railroads, right? This is dotting the land. And this, of course, is indicative of what we're talking about, right? Okay, so who are the big boys here playing this game? Well, we already talked about Rockefeller a little bit, but you also have Andrew Carnegie. We're going to look at him a little bit. And Cornelius Vanderbilt, the most snooty bourgeois name ever, Cornelius Vanderbilt. But he makes a lot of money off railroads. Now, I love this picture. This is Standard Oil Company, and that's Rockefeller's oil company. And look, he is just taking over everything, right? This monster. And for those that are interested, where do you see Standard Oil Company today? Chevron is what we call the shadow, if you will, of Rockefeller Standard Oil Company. Oh, we're talking about monopolies. Let's talk about monopolies. What are monopolies? Okay, you've heard of them. Let's make sure you understand. So this is the time where, because there isn't much protection, a company can come in and just control the majority of one industry. So there are really two types of monopolies I want to talk about today. And the first one's called vertical integration, and the second is horizontal integration. Now, what I want to do is show you how they both were being, I think, practiced pretty heavily during the Gilded Age. So let's look at vertical. So vertical, and the guy who did this was Carnegie with steel. And this idea is that you own everything from production to distribution within a company. Now, let's think about this and ask you a question. do you participate, or do you see any companies participating in vertical integration today? I want you to write down if you can think of a company that does that. Okay. Some of you, if you did say something like Walmart, if you said something like Target, or maybe even Target, Walmart, McDonald's, these are all, sorry, I got lost there for a second. You got vertical integration. So, let's take Walmart, for example. This is a perfect example. Let's say you buy the Great Value brand, Frosted Flakes. That's a Walmart company. So what we know is that they owned the corn, right? And then they owned the factory where they produce the corn and the sugar. And then they owned the trains and the semi-trucks, the amount of semis you see and carrying the Walmart. And they, of course, have the warehouses and the stores. So this is why generic is usually cheaper, because they own all means of production. Now, if you were to buy Kellogg's, right, you would see that Kellogg's, they get paid money from Walmart. So they're going to charge you more for that. That's how vertical integration works. And you still see it today quite a bit, actually. I mean, it's I think that they try to limit it a little bit, but it's still pretty much there in a lot of ways. Okay, so horizontal, this is one where you know more about, probably this is a typical monopoly, which is the idea of you own all products, right? So let's say I'm the only one that sells cars, right? So you have to buy a car, you have to buy one from me. It means I can choose how much I sell that car for. I get to price it. There's no competition. So, and this is what Rockefeller does. So let's talk about these two guys real quick. Here's Rockefeller's Carnegie. I want to tell you a little bit about their history, just real quickly, and then we'll move on. So Rockefeller's an interesting guy from the East, and he kind of figures out the way he makes most of his money is actually from the byproduct of oil. And what do I mean by that? Well, okay, so you really feel bad for farmers back at this time, because they had all this black stuff coming out of the ground. Like, they can't grow anything on this. So many of them abandoned their farms in Texas and Oklahoma, which is horrible, because this is oil. Rockefeller sees the power of it, right? He sees the importance of it. Now, at first, the byproduct of oil is he's going to be making things like Vaseline. He's going to be making things like asphalt. In fact, if you look at all plastics, which doesn't come around till later, but most everything's made out of oil. I mean, not most everything, but a lot of things that use oil to make. And so that becomes Rockefeller's way. That's how he becomes rich. Now, once cars come around, right, he's able to sell his oil. That's when they become really rich. And then finally, how does he become the richest man ever in American history? Well, he does it by something called undercutting the competition. And let's talk about how he does this real quick, because it's quite fascinating, actually. So what Rockefeller does is he would go to someone's home. Let's back up and say that you are somebody who owns an oil rig, and you own it, in Texas somewhere, and you've had it in your family name. Your grandparents started it. Your grandpa started it. You've had it, right? So here it is. It's yours, and you're never going to sell it. Rockefeller comes to your house, and you know about him because he's got the Standard Oil Company, and he knocks on your door. And he says, "Hey, I want to buy your oil company." And your first response is going to be like, "Nah, this is my family's. We're going to hold on to it. Thanks." And Rockefeller says, "I understand that, but here's what's going to happen. If you don't sell me your oil company, I'm going to put a rig across the street from you. And whatever you sell your oil from, I'm going to sell my oil for 15 cents less. Your company's going to go out of business, and then I'm just going to get it. So it's better if you just sell it to me now." Do you see how messed up that is? I mean, part of me is like, wow, how brilliant is that? The other part is like, you're kind of messing up the whole system, right, of competition. And just to show you that, at one point, Rockefeller owns 95% of all the oil in the United States of America. That's how you become the richest man in American history. Carnegie's not that far behind him. He's probably $8 billion. You know what I mean? So he's right there. How's he make his money? Well, he makes his money off steel. And we love Carnegie's story because he really is that story of the American dream. He was a penniless Scotsman who rose up out of nothing. And what we loved about him was he works hard. He was always the first to work and the last to leave. And he works harder than anyone else. He actually starts as a bobbin boy, which he replaces the bobbin for seamstresses who were making clothing. And then he slowly makes his way up, and he finally invests in steel, right? He sees the power of, steel, which is so much more powerful and stronger than iron. And then he eventually, as you saw, vertical integration, takes control of all the different means of this. And that's how they become so rich. So what do we do with guys like this? I mean, Rockefeller becomes so rich. I love it. He's swallowing J.P. Morgan here. J.P. Morgan, the big banker tycoon. Of course, if you use Chase, that's J.P. Morgan's company. Morgan just being swallowed by these guys, and Rockefeller's got everybody in his pocket. And this is why it's really a businessman's world. So what do we do with them? Should we celebrate them? Because they broke the system, right? They figured this out, and anyone could have done it, and they just did it. Or should we look down on them because they broke the system and they screwed up what it means to be kind of a competitive country, right? Now there's only one major group, and it's called crony capitalism. So, something to think about in terms of what are the good and bads that come when you have a monopoly. Okay, let's talk about the rise of corruption in America. How does it become a politician? I talked about the businessman. Let's look at the politician. So you have this guy, and his name is Boss Tweed. And Tweed is, his name is William Tweed. He's part of the Democratic political machine called Tammany Hall. And what he does is he becomes the king of skimming off the top. Skimming off the top. That's okay. I'm sorry about my... I don't think that helped. Okay, so I want to actually show you a video that's going to give you some ideas about what Tweed does here. So let's pay attention to this. It's kind of fascinating.
Fireman and one-time chairmaker from the Lower East Side. There had never been anyone quite like William M. Tweed. Over 6 feet tall and nearly 300 pounds, he was surprisingly nimble and graceful on his feet. Caricatured by his Republican opponents as a vulgar, hard-drinking Irishman, he was in fact a fourth-generation Scots Protestant, unfailingly courteous and nearly teetotal. He was also a superb politician who took care of his mainly immigrant constituency, providing jobs for the unemployed, coal in winter, and orphanages, hospitals, and shelters for the poor.
He was one of the first people who saw the power of mass politics in the cities.
And I think that's important for you to know here. So what gives William Tweed the power as a politician is he found all these immigrants, and he would meet them down at the shores, and he'd give them blankets, and he'd give them food. He'd say, hey, my name's William Tweed, vote for me. It was very Jacksonian in that way, except instead of using the farmer, he uses the immigrant. And because of that, because New York is full of so many immigrants, and we'll talk about why in a couple minutes, Tweed becomes absolutely the most powerful man in the city.
And for all his thievery, there was the recognition of mobilizing this mass of people to some political end. I think he's not remembered for that. He's remembered for the $50 million that he stole, which if you wanted to get the equivalent today, multiply times 10.
So, let's kind of skip ahead here a little bit, but this becomes the whole point here is that Tweed is so much power, he can become corrupt. And he knows he's corrupt, and nobody can do anything about it. He thinks. Let's introduce you to someone named Thomas Nast.
In 1870, as newspaper editors and indignant reformers began questioning where Tweed's lavish lifestyle came from, all eyes turned to the still unfinished county courthouse on Chambers Street, a special project of Tweed's. Begun in 1858, it was supposed to have cost $350,000. 12 years later, the price tag had reached $13 million. and kept right on rising.
Okay, so how do you do that, right? How do you have a building and everyone says it's going to cost $350,000, and about 10 years later, the price tag is up to $13 million? I want to show you the brilliance of Tweed here.
Somehow this one building, which is actually quite a nice building, wound up costing more than the entire Houses of Parliament. Well, you know, the deal is straightforward. We want to buy a lot of chairs. How much does that chair cost? Let's say $5. Now, says Tweed, you don't mean $5, you mean $50. Oh, I do. All right. And, you know, give me the chair, $50, you know, 20 back for you, and so forth.
Even the most worldly New Yorkers knew that something had to be done.
So I hope that makes sense to you, right? So this idea of that you're just tricking the government. The government's never going to check you that closely. So you say, oh, this guy says it's going to cost a lot of money, and the government just writes a check. And what you do is you take all the extra cash. And that's how you start to make yourself a lot of money.
People begin to tire of holding their noses, George Templeton Strong wrote, and are looking about in a helpless way for some remedy.
No caliph, Khan, or Caesar has risen to power or opulence more rapidly than Tweed I. 10 years ago, this monarch was pursuing the humble occupation of a chairmaker. He now rules the state as Napoleon ruled France. There is absolutely nothing in the city which is beyond the reach of the insatiable gang who have obtained possession of it. The New York Times.
In 1869, a German-born artist named Thomas Nast, with close ties to the Republican Party, began publishing a series of political cartoons in Harper's Weekly.
And you got to write this guy's name down as Thomas Nast. It's N-A-S-T. You got to love this guy because he's one of the first. I mean, there have been political cartoonists before this, but he's the one who really starts to see massive change because of his cartoons.
Week after week, Nast relentlessly excoriated what he called the Tammany Hall Ring. There was Peter Brains Sweeney, the city treasurer. Mayor Abraham Oakey Hall, Tweed's puppet in City Hall. Richard Slippery Dick Connolly, the comptroller. And Boss Tweed himself, whom Nast depicted as a licentious, balding, overfed monster, literally devouring the city. I don't care a straw for newspaper articles, Tweed declared. My constituents don't know how to read. But they can't help seeing them damned pictures.
He was the object of one of the most successful campaigns by a political cartoonist in history. Thomas Nast really did the most extraordinary job of attacking Tweed and exposing the Tweed Ring in Harper's Weekly.
And I mean, this idea of taking cartoons to expose the muck that was happening in the city life was pretty ingenious, and it sort of gave him protection because it was supposed to be comedy, but there was reality in it, you know?
Those pictures will live forever. The way you can never separate Nixon from Woodward and Bernstein, you can't separate Tweed from Thomas Nast. They're wed together for the rest of history, I guess.
On July 8th, 1871, the New York Times joined the fray.
And listen to this, because
Publishing
this is
excerpts from
crazy.
secret courthouse records, obtained from a disgruntled city official. Tweed had cheated out of thousands of dollars in kickbacks. The figures were astonishing. 11 thermometers had been purchased for $7,500.
Think about that. Thermometers for $7,000 in 1868.
Dust brooms for $41,000.
Dust brooms for $41,000. That's crazy.
One contractor had been paid $5.5 million for window shades, carpets, and furniture. It would never be clear how much Tweed's corruption had been exaggerated by the press. The New York Times put the final tally at almost $200 million.
So there you go, right? And I think that's the whole problem here. Is that, you know, nobody was able really to control this guy. Okay. So speaking of immigrants, you know, I want you to write down new immigration. This is a new concept here that hits the American public. As you know, people always came from places like England and Germany and Ireland, right? We talked about this, but now all of a sudden, people are coming from Austria and Italy and Russia. And so you're getting an overwhelming amount of people, and it bottlenecks you. And that leads us to a very important place. the growth of urbanization here. So many people are coming in, and this is why the East Coast gets so big. Look at New York, right? We'll talk about that in just a few minutes. But people are coming to Chicago. We talked about at the beginning, and even St. Louis and Kansas City. But most people stay East Coast. Look at that big old blob there of people coming in here. Of course, where do you bottleneck all these people? Well, you got to send them to Ellis Island. So let's just start a little clip. I'm actually going to turn the volume off and have you write down a couple things right here. And the first being that one right there. That from 1892 to 1954, Ellis Island will be America's largest immigration station. And so make sure you get that down. It's estimated that 12 million immigrants will pass through Ellis Island. 12 million. And, that, and I'll give you numbers at the end to show you how many people are related to somebody coming to Ellis Island. It's quite astounding. So a couple things about it, right? It was a very small island. They actually rebuilt it. And what you're going to see here is they're telling you this. It's a perfect example of creative destruction. So they made the island bigger. Well, how'd they do it? Well, they destroyed the underground where they made the subway tunnels, all that fill. Ooh, that made the island bigger. So there was a fire that destroyed the building, which sucks for historians. We lost all these immigration records. But they decided to make a new building, and it looked like a railroad. Baggage room. Dining hall, all of these things that could be useful, right? And a hospital for those that are very sick. So how do you get here? Let's talk about getting to America. Well, when you first come here, you just simply have to take something called the 6-second medical exam. Write that down. So they'd look at you for 6 seconds. If they can see if you're sick within 6 seconds, then they're going to push you aside. But if you can, you can keep it together, don't cough for 6 seconds, you'd be all right. If you did need a full exam, they'd mark you with chalk, and then they would look at you for a little longer. Okay, let's say you made it through medical exam. You would then go to the Great Hall to be processed. And it was this huge, huge building here, huge room. And you would just sit around and you would wait for your name to be called. And the average processing time, 3 to 4 hours. Think about this today. The average processing time for somebody who want to become a citizen today, 20 years. Okay, so when you come, you're asked some questions. What's your age? What's your name? Can you read or write? It's a big one. Do you carry any money? And this is a big one for all of us to think about today. 2% of immigrants were denied admission. Think about where we are today, and this is something I do want you to write down, okay? So it's about the opposite. Today, it's about 98% of denied admission. And so what that tells us something very important. Back then, and I'd like you to write this down, it was easy to come to America, but it was hard to live. It was easy to come to America, but it was hard to live. Today, it's the opposite. Today, it's hard to get to America, but it's relatively easy to live. And so things have switched around here because of that. Okay, so another thing to understand is 1/3 of the approved just stay there in New York. And you got these little towns that come up, Little Italy, a little Chinatown. This is why they're all over the place. You ever been there? And 1/3 is a pretty large amount, right? And one thing to understand about this is just how large New York is compared to other cities. Our second largest city in the United States today is LA, and roughly about 4 million people. New York, the largest, is 9 million. So nothing even comes close to it in terms of size. So 1 year, 1 million people passed through. It's pretty insane. So, some famous people, you might have heard of these guys, maybe not. They're famous actors from back in the day. Cary Grant, some of you might have heard of. But in the 1920s, we decided we don't like immigration. We'll actually talk about that in a little bit. And they shut it down. And, it actually serves as a detaining center for World War II. It shut down after war, and now it's become really a place everybody needs to go to. When you go to New York, a museum, you can go check your relatives out and see who came here, who didn't. And one of the most important numbers, I'll tell you this right now, is the last thing I want you to understand, is 40% of all of us can trace part of our ancestry to Ellis Island. That's how I think big that is. So something to keep in mind. Okay, so we're good with everybody coming except the Chinese. In 1882, we were like, no Chinese in America. And so we shut down immigration there. Okay, so what about, let's scrape that gold apart for a second and talk about the working and living conditions. Look, everything's great if you're an oil tycoon, if you're Rockefeller or Carnegie, but most Americans, these immigrants come over here, they lived in pretty crappy situations. There was no protection. You're noticing right here, think about the child labor. And just the types of homes. There was no home or house regulation, sanitation regulation. And we're just no environmental protection. We're pilling the smoke in the air, which makes the air dirty. That's the destructive part. I love this picture taken by Jacob Riis. We'll actually talk about it when we get to the progressive era in a little bit, who shows you what happens to these people as they come off these boats after Ellis Island, right? It's hard to believe this is America, right? This is the way people lived back then. Look at their homes. Now a couple streets away, where do you get? You get to Millionaire's Row, right? These fancy homes. This is the gold that Twain's talking about. And we all kind of live in a Gilded Age, don't we? Think about nice areas in Ogden, for example. There are some places that on the East Bench up there that are very beautiful, very nice. If you were just to look at that, you'd think, oh, America's really good. But take a closer look, inner city, there's problems. Well, workers start to really strike. Some of the more important strikes that come about it because of unions that come up. But you have the Haymarket riot where, they were striking for their rights at this factory in Chicago. They throw a bomb in the middle and kill a bunch of policemen. The Pullman strike. It really closed down the whole nation in terms of trains because of this, right? So everybody, all the trainers across the world, across the nation, the trains shut down. They stopped working. So, strikes become an important part. Another part that's important about the Gilded Age is this really has to do with Victorian culture and the idea of the white man. And it's his world now, and this idea of separate spheres is important with the Victorians. And what this is this is simply about the role of a man and the role of a woman, right? The woman stays home. It's separate from the man who is taking care of business and the politics, the money. The woman takes care of the children and the dinner, right? And there is this is a Venn diagram, right? You keep these circles separate. Someone who really kind of promulgated this idea of the white Victorian man, of course, Charles Darwin. And Darwin everyone knows him for his ideas of evolution. And of course, the idea of adaptation, that we adapt and naturally, he calls it natural selection. He didn't come up with the idea of survival of the fittest, but that's a term that's used. The idea that if you are strong, you'll survive. That's Darwin's idea. He didn't really ever apply this too much to humans, a little bit here and there. But it wasn't until this man named Herbert Spencer started to say, he takes it to a very dangerous place. And he says, I'm going to show you how evolution works. He's going to say, there are people more evolved than others. And that's based entirely on the color of your skin. So you can see how kind of messed up this is. The idea is that the whiter you are, the more evolved you are. And he says, let's take a map of Northern Europe, of the world. Let's start in Northern Europe. Look at the Scandinavians and the Swedish and the Danish. And these guys, Spencer claimed, are more evolved. They're better humans. They're smarter. They're more capable of things. The further south you go, you're getting down to Spain and Italy. They're a little darker skin, not as evolved. They're still kind of there. Keep going, though. We're in trouble. We're in Africa. These guys are only one step away from the monkeys. They're less evolved. And you see how racist this is, but it allows you, and this is what you need to write down about social Darwinism, it allows you to justify racism. It allows you to justify it. And that way people, they can progress this way. Carnegie was a huge believer in social Darwinism. He believed as a white man, he was more capable. And that's why he became so important, so powerful, is because he was more evolved and he could make all this money. Let me give you an example of how crazy this was. This was a science textbook, it's from a science textbook. This is how they taught the difference between skulls to show you social Darwinism. So you have the white man who has the formed brain, right? Evolved skull. And then the Creole Negro, that's closer to the young chimpanzee, not as evolved. See, now this is pseudoscience, this is bullcrap science. There's nothing true about it, but it is used to justify the Gilded Age, how you can have $11 billion and people are living in those kind of shacks And so that's one of the most dangerous things that come out of this. These young Victorian families, right, believed heavily in social Darwinism. Okay, finally want to leave you today. I'm almost done. You're doing awesome, and then we'll have part 2, and that won't be as long, and then we'll call it for this week. But we have to talk about the farmers and what happens. Notice what's happening where people are working now. They're in factories. Look at where people are living, right? Rural, of course, being out in the country, urban. By the time most people live in the rural, but look at the difference. We're switching. Look at the population change. Well, what we call cultures in conflict, and this is the rise of the shadows of Jefferson and the farmers who feel like they're losing their way. And they start a party, a political party called the Populist Party, and that runs from about 1867 to 1896. And the idea of the populace is, the farmer's being left behind, and he needs to get that power back. So who leads the way? Well, none other than a guy by the name of William Jennings Bryan, and he is a spokesman for the farmer. One of the most important things they're fighting for is more money in the market, which is the idea of free silver, which we could talk about in a little bit, and the regulation of the railroads. They need to be able to control their finance a little bit, because the railroads are gouging them on prices, how much it costs to ship their food. I want you to just listen for a second about William Jennings Bryan, why he talks about the farmer.
As holy as the cause of liberty, the cause of humanity. Mr. Carlyle said in 1878 that this was a struggle between the idle holders of idle capital and the struggling masses who produce the wealth and pay the taxes of the country. They tell us that the great cities are in favor of the gold standard. We reply that the great cities rest upon our broad and fertile prairies. Burn down your cities and leave our farms, and your cities will spring up again as if by magic. But destroy our farms, and the grass will grow in the streets of every city of the country.
And I think that's his point, right? You really don't want to destroy the farmer. And as a response, they push back. So one of the things they're really fighting for back is something else to back their money. So right at this point during history in the 1880s, 1890s, it is gold that backs your cash. So cash is going to be printed based by how much gold we have. Well, you have so many people moving in America, they need to print more cash so cash can get available. The problem is there's not that much gold. We call this deflation. It makes cash worth more, but not very much cash is going around. The rich men love this because they have all the cash. What the farmers want is silver to be introduced with gold. That's called the bimetallism, two metals. So what this gives them is now with their silver, you can print more cash in people's hands. They have more money to spend on farming goods, in farmers. The problem, of course, for the rich man is that their money decreases in value. So you can kind of read this and make sense. But this is one of the biggest debates happening this time. And that was it. They were losing prices on crops. They had no cash. They were mortgaging, and therefore they were foreclosing. And, what are you going to do here as a farmer but push back? So it wasn't that, and this is important, it wasn't that the farmers didn't utilize machines. It's not that they didn't see the importance of them. I mean, look at corn, look at wheat, look at oats, right? They can make it a lot quicker. But the thing was that they didn't have a control over selling their product. So they weren't making as much money on this. So they decided to run. They first run in 1892, and they actually win some. Which is a third party, which is pretty impressive. They only won really only won 5 states or something. But back then, we've never seen a third party do this well. So they decide to run again in 1896 and fuse together with the Democrats. Maybe they could beat the Northerners, and they still can't win, which tells us a very important thing, doesn't it? And this sort of ends our conversation today, that despite the fact that the farmer's important and the Southerners important, and they've got their place, this is a northern man's world. This is a northern businessman's world. And no matter what happens, we see that, don't we? Still to this day. And that's the significance of this. Okay, I will post another video pretty soon. This is the first one. Please, now that I've kind of talked to you, it's your turn. Let me hear what you thought was interesting about this lecture. Get in discussions under Canvas, and there'll be a place where you can submit your ideas. Okay,